Really quickly before we get into this video, this theory is based upon my last two theories, so if you haven't watched those theories yet, I highly recommend doing so, as if you haven't, this video won't make much sense. I'll also share my complete theory on the chain of events and timeline of the Sheikah, the creator of the Lens of Truth, Bongo, the Well, the Shadow Temple, the Gerudo, and the Hyrulean Civil War. What's the history of the Shadow Temple? What's the history of the Well? Why was the Lens of Truth sealed at the bottom of the well? What is Dead Hand? I'll discuss the name of Bongo's clan, where their hideout was located, the timeline of events that will make total sense of everything I've discussed. Firstly, I think it's important to discuss a major part of my theory that I sort of glossed over in my last video, and that is the question of how Bongo ever gained the power of disguise in the first place. Once again, there is a parallel to the Yiga clan that would make perfect sense in answering this question. Of course, as I theorized before, I believe that Bongo and Master Koga were both leaders of a clan of Sheikah traders, and that the two clans were very similar, being counterparts if you will. So if we are to believe that Bongo is the spiritual predecessor of Master Koga, then both leaders must have their own secret technique of gaining such a magical ability. But how? As the Breath of the Wild Masterworks, a canonical book published by Nintendo might I add, points out, only the leader of the Yiga clan can master a secret technique that gives him the same power possessed by ancient energy sources. And we can infer that it comes from ancient technology passed down in secret. So Master Koga had a secret technique that allowed him to gain the ability of secret Sheikah technology. Now, what secret technology from Ocarina of Time would Bongo be able to master a secret technique for that would allow him to gain its ability? Of course, it's the Lens of Truth. We know that the Lens of Truth was handed down in Kakariko village, presumably by the high-ranking Sheikah. Because I'm sure that after the fiasco where the Gerudo learned about the Lens of Truth, the high-ranking Sheikah wouldn't allow just any random Joe to wield it. Bongo, probably even being one of the high-ranking Sheikah, must have had access to the precious Lens of Truth and absorbed its power, subsequently being able to be unseen and see the unseen, just as the creator of the Lens of Truth was. Bongo, just like Master Koga, then taught the secret technique to the members of his clan, and they were able to use his technique to a lesser, yet still effective degree. And keep in mind, this is not a far-fetched theory. We saw these exact same things happen with the Yiga clan. This is only another direct parallel that would make lots of sense. After Bongo and his clan became proficient in magical disguise, something had to be done by the Sheikah to counter their attacks. Just like the Yiga clan, Bongo's clan must have masqueraded as travelers, or even members of Sheikah society, in order to get to Impa, or to steal things from the Sheikah. This meant that the Sheikah's first line of defense was the Lens of Truth. Ironically, the very item that gave this clan their powers in the first place. The Lens of Truth sees through magical illusions, which would serve quite well to see through the magical disguises put on by members of Bongo's clan. And this is why the Lens of Truth was handed down in Kakariko village. Eventually though, Bongo's clan must have somehow snuck under the radar of the probing eye of truth, and they must have gotten to the Shadow Temple. But how do we know this? Let's take a closer look at the Shadow Temple. It's only then that we will see it for what it really was. As soon as Link enters the Shadow Temple, the first invisible wall he comes across says, "The shadow will yield only to one with the Eye of Truth." Do you notice anything interesting about this line of dialogue in particular? The words, "the shadow," are capitalized as if it's a title. But who or what would be named the Shadow? I doubt it would be Bongo himself, because unless he was a cringy CW supervillain, he'd probably stick with his already weird name of Bongo. No, I believe that the Shadow is in reference to Bongo's clan. They must have been called the Shadow Clan, and this would mean that the Shadow Temple was their hideout. What evidence is there to support this though? Believe it or not, there is yet another parallel that we can draw to the Yiga clan. The entrance to the Shadow Temple, which I am proposing was the Shadow Clan's hideout, has always fascinated me as it's a very unique entrance. There's a round pedestal surrounded by many torches. And where else do we see a round pedestal surrounded by many torches other than at the entrance to the Yiga clan hideout? Then there's also the fact that Bongo, after escaping the well, immediately goes to the Shadow Temple, as if that's where he feels most comfortable, as if that's his most advantageous position. He also somehow knows his way to the deepest part of the temple where his giant bongo drum is. But wait, this is the Shadow Temple. It's where the Sheikah executed people. There are guillotines and shackles and blood spatter everywhere. Absolutely, the Shadow Temple was used by the Sheikah for executions and torture. But I also believe the Shadow Temple saw various role changes throughout history. I believe, admittedly arbitrarily, that the Shadow Temple was originally built as a burial place. This would make sense, seeing as it is in Kakariko graveyard after all. The entrance looks quite a bit like a mausoleum, and the initial rooms where we find the hover boots look very much like a burial complex. At some point, the royal family of Hyrule must have ordered that torture chambers be built. The Sheikah, being the servants to the royal family of Hyrule, did as they demanded and turned the Shadow Temple into a place for executions. Another thing that others have theorized that I totally agree with is that at some point the Shadow Temple was connected to Hyrule Castle via waterway. It would make a lot of sense. Criminals would be brought to the castle for a sentencing and then shipped off to the Shadow Temple to be punished in whatever way the royal family saw fit. Not to mention how there's a fairy with a Triforce symbol on it, and Link needs to play Zelda's lullaby to get it to move. I believe that once the Shadow Clan made the dungeon their hideout, however, the way to the castle was sealed off, and the Shadow Temple would act as a great hideout since it was in disuse and had a direct view of Kakariko. The Sheikah, knowing that the temple had been compromised, drained the well and set up essentially what would act as a Shadow Temple Part 2 during the Hyrulean Civil War. Alright, let's get to the bottom of this well. Pun intended. So I just theorized that the Shadow Temple had once been used as a burial place. And if we are to consider the well an extension of the Shadow Temple, which it pretty obviously is as all of these same assets and designs were used, then that theory is all but confirmed by this room containing the caskets. But of course the well had to double as a burial place and execution chamber during the war. We see all of the same torture equipment that we see in the Shadow Temple at the bottom of the well. Any members of the Shadow Clan that were caught by the Sheikah must have been executed there, and this is why we see so many undead enemies, the most prominent of which being the first dead hand that Link faces. The dead hands are intriguing for 4 reasons. Reason number 1 being their teeth are shockingly white. Seriously, these guys must brush and floss at least twice a day. Reason 2 is that they look suspiciously like the Glob Glob Gab Glab. Reason 3 is that they summon enemies called Infinite Hands. And reason number 4, for being enemies named Dead Hand, their hands sure aren't anything to write home about. I mean, what are these little T-Rex nubs? Now, about the Infinite Hands that the Dead Hands summon, we know from Skyward Sword that disembodied arms can be their own distinct entities, not really having to be attached to anything. So I believe that each Infinite Hand is its own distinct entity, and I believe that each one is simply an undead member of the Shadow Clan, probably of a lower rank. The Dead Hands, however, must have been the higher ranking members of the Shadow Clan, perhaps Bongo's attendants or chiefs. But wait, how are the Dead Hands connected to Bongo? It is possible that, like Bongo, they had their legs and hands cut off as punishment for thieving. It does look like that would be the case. And what look to be their arms also appear on Bongo's neck, a pretty random detail to add by the game designers. Yes, I believe that the Dead Hands and Infinite Hands were members of the Shadow Clan. Now, finally, I can share what I believe to have been the chain of events that will hopefully make sense of everything I've discussed up to this point. The Sheikah, or the Shadow Folk as they were known, were once a flourishing tribe of helpers to the royal family of Hyrule. Everything was right in the country of Hyrule, and the races all got along swimmingly, for a time anyway. The Sheikah were an esoteric and ritualistic race, always practicing techniques to train their mind's eye. There was one member of the Sheikah, though, who took things a step further than mere training. He was a poet and keeper of ancient texts and literature. In his possession was a book containing a spell that bestowed upon him the ability to become invisible and see the invisible. It was heard that Ganondorf had killed the composers of the royal family of Hyrule, the brothers Sharp and Flat, for having not complied with his demands to see their research about the effect of ocarinas on time. Growing fearful of Ganondorf, this Sheikah man created the Lens of Truth as an extension of his power, a physical third eye. He attempted to use this magical item as a peace offering to the Gerudo, in the hopes that his life would be spared by Ganondorf. However, he was caught red-handed by a Sheikah commander, one named Bongo, at the Gerudo fortress and fled into the desert where he remains to this day as the Phantom Guide and can still be heard reciting his poetry. A brief battle ensued between Bongo's forces and the Gerudo over the Lens of Truth, with Bongo's side coming away victorious in retrieving the item. This battle was an event that would act as the precursor to the Hyrulean Civil War. The Lens of Truth was taken back to Kakariko village and handed down by the high-ranking Sheikah. The Sheikah man's house was torn down and a well was built in its place. Impa did preserve the book of spells he had used though, which has since been lying on the table in her house. Bongo, who was destined to become corrupt, knew of a secret technique passed down in his family lineage that allowed him to absorb the power possessed by energy sources. In secret, he performed this technique with the Lens of Truth and gained the ability to be unseen and see the unseen. Eventually, he began plotting alongside Ganondorf to kill Impa, the leader of the Sheikah. When his conspiracy was found out though by the other high-ranking Sheikah, he and his followers scattered about the land. Posing as travelers, these traitors made attempts during the war to infiltrate the Sheikah, but none were successful, as the Sheikah were still armed with the Lens of Truth, which allowed them to see through their magical disguises. Via waterway from Hyrule Castle, Bongo's clan entered into the Shadow Temple, an old execution chamber and burial place that had been in disuse for many years. The Sheikah learned of this and knew that they had to improvise another execution chamber that would be able to house the members of Bongo's clan, and they chose to use the well. After all, the well is dark, narrow, and scary, a perfect place for executions. Some members of Bongo's clan, the Shadow Clan, eventually tried to steal back the Lens of Truth, and perhaps steal other items like the hover boots from the Gerudo, but were largely unsuccessful. Many were caught, executed, and sealed at the bottom of the well. The remaining members were left relatively defenseless inside of the Shadow Temple, where they were executed. The undead members of the Shadow Clan became grotesque monsters, with wounds clearly showing the ways in which they were executed. With most of the Sheikah having died in the Hyrulean Civil War that raged during these events, Impa was one of the last remaining Sheikah. Just as the Sheikah in Breath of the Wild decided to cast off their technological advances after the Great Calamity, the Sheikah in Ocarina of Time did the same after the Hyrulean Civil War. This is why the Lens of Truth was sealed away in the well, and why Kakariko Village was rebuilt by Impa and opened up to outsiders. Yes, this is my theory as to the history of the Sheikah in Ocarina of Time. Well, there you have it, the final installment in this theory extravaganza. The videos in the series took weeks of research each, and nothing I've said here is all that far-fetched when you think about it. A lot of the things I theorized in the series actually happened in Breath of the Wild, and many other things could be explained as history repeating itself, as it so often does in the Zelda series. I did spend a lot of time making sure that these events that I linked together would make sense from a logical and chronological standpoint, but in the end, it is a theory. As always, I thank you so much for watching, and make sure to subscribe for more, my Hylians.